Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I hope that you had a great weekend. If you live in the States, I hope you had a great holiday weekend. If you don't live in the States, I still hope you had a great weekend. It's been a fun time of working on the challenge. I can't believe we're kind of right smack dab in the middle of it. And it's just exciting. So this week we're going to be talking about in the live chat about geometric designs that we worked through in this week's video. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I'm going to break up the next couple weeks of designs, and I'm going to answer your questions live. So if you're watching this with me live right now, make sure to type your questions in the chat. Jessica's here kind of monitoring those, and she will give them to me at the end so that I can answer them live. This is a fun way to be able to make sure that you're getting everything that you need out of the content that I'm sharing. So super excited about that. This week's video was a day late. I won't say late, it was just came out on Wednesday instead. I had way too much fun on the 4th, swimming with the family and spending time with my nieces and nephews and other families. So thank you for the forgiveness on that. Another thing about this week's video is these videos are so big. I'm trying to cram so much content in them, and I'm thinking, wow, maybe I shouldn't have put so much in there, but man, I'm never really good at pulling myself back. Those that know me know that I really like to just overdo things. So this week's video has kind of 4 main designs that we talked through, and then I just released another design today, and we have another one coming out. So I'm going to going forward, kind of break up the videos a little bit. The swirls video was like 20 minutes long, and it's a lot to do at once. So I'm going to break them up, make them a little bit more consumable for you, a little bit easier for me to wrap my mind around. And if you're like, oh, where do I find those videos? They're always going to be on the challenge page. You can check out the link in the description box. It'll take you to the main page of all the videos. But they'll also be on my YouTube channel. So if you want to get an alert, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll get an alert when they come out. So anyway, I just released another one today. So you can kind of watch those trickle through. And then I'm planning on going back and I have a couple that I need to release for the swirls, and we're just going to kind of pack all those, unpack them all for you. So this week's challenge, I kind of divided up into geometric shapes. So we kind of left the swirl, the curvy lines behind, and we kind of introduced the straight-ish lines that can create some fillers. And in the handout, I kind of mentioned, it just shows that designs do not have to be difficult to be impactful. So I think that's what's great about machine quilting. You can still get really neat effects. You can still get really cool results with designs that aren't necessarily complex or overly intricate. So let's look over and talk about some of the things that we learned this week. Again, we talked through the geometric designs, and we kind of started with the straight line with the back and forth and built off of it. So we're going to kind of touch base on all of those. Now, if you are watching any of the videos and you're struggling, I cannot recommend enough to get the free quilting diagrams. I mean, I take a lot of time to put those together, so I want you to take advantage of them. But if you need step-by-step directions, you need a little bit more tips, something to really keep next to you, check out that expanded resource. It's less than $5, and it has tons and tons of diagrams, step-by-step, and tips. And the more I make these, the more ornate they get, because the more you do of anything, the better you get. And they're getting big. I was like, this is basically like a booklet. So I hope that you find them helpful if you need that. I know that sometimes you'll look at a design and think, oh, just clicks, you don't need it, perfect. But if you're struggling, don't struggle. You don't have to struggle. You can get some help with that. So this week's geometric designs, I demonstrated on the custom panel for the challenge, but I also quilted up some of them in the pillow panel, just to show those of you that are quilting on the pillow panel a little idea of the placement there. Not huge areas for the designs we're working with, but still a great way to practice some of those things. So first we started with the back and forth lines. And what's funny is all these designs I've taught live in classes before. And this is the one I'd always joke and say, like, you're going to love this design, but right now you're going to wonder why you're paying money to learn it. It's so basic in how it goes together, but it just works in a lot of different areas on a lot of different quilts. This is something that can really squish down areas of your quilt to make something else pop out. So it's going to be kind of like the Pebbles design, one of those things that's really going to highlight something, but it can also be quilted nice and big, a bigger scale to just give it a nice texture. Not so easy with Pebbles, so this is going to be a little bit more versatile in that way. But what we're doing here is instead of quilting that long, dense line over the whole area, we're breaking it up into columns. And this is important because if you're working on, let's say, a sewing machine, a small threaded sewing machine, or even on a long arm, instead of having to quilt all the way over and then come all the way back, I'm kind of quilting them in columns and hooking them together. And it's going to give us the same exact result, just an easier way to manage it. And even if you look at this design and you think, I don't like it or whatever, I hope it will show you that you can take a design and rearrange the way you approach it to make it convenient for you. Quilting should be fun and it shouldn't be stressful. So if you're having difficulty with a design, ask yourself if you can't make it a little bit easier. So when you're quilting your columns, they can be any width or length depending on the direction that you're quilting them. In the video, I show how on the sewing machine I tend to quilt vertically because I love to get that momentum going. I love to quilt vertically, but on my long arm, I prefer to quilt horizontally. Again, it doesn't matter, but when I'm quilting, that doesn't matter how long or wide or tall the columns are, just as long as the spacing between the lines is somewhat consistent. And I usually quilt this at least a 1/4 inch or at most a 1/4 inch apart because I love to use the foot of my machine as a guide. So I'll run that foot along that previously quilted line and know that it's pretty close to a 1/4 of an inch. There's some other things you can do with this. You can change up the scale within the design, so you can make it closer at the bottom and further apart at the top to give some depth to the quilt, especially for panels or landscapes. You can also use that change of scale to bring attention to an area. So if I have a big quilt and a couple blocks I really want to show off, I can quilt those back and forth lines closer around that, but as I get away from that main element, I can quilt them further apart. So again, I didn't really get into all of that, but you can change this up in a lot of different ways to create some cool effects. Well, then we kind of moved from that to the geometric all over, and this is where we're quilting kind of boxes and kind of creating this boxy shape. And it's funny because this is one of the easiest designs to teach because there's not a whole lot to say about it. You're quilting boxes, you're left turn, right turning. I try to give some tips, but maybe not always easy in the application, right? We all kind of know what a box looks like. We can all visualize that, but it's the working our way through the area that gets to be a little bit of a struggle. So as you're quilting, if you're trying this out, just pause, think through the next couple steps, kind of think where you need to go and just keep on going. Soon you'll kind of develop a routine in a way that you quilt it. So I also pointed out that my corners, you can see right here in the example, tend to be more mid-century modern. I'm always kind of skating around that corner pretty quick. We know I like to quilt fast, and so I'm not even worried that they're all perfectly sharp. I just say that this is just how it's supposed to look. But if you want sharp corners, you can hesitate just a fraction of a second to get that nice sharp point. Of all the fillers, this is the one I probably don't use very often, just because I like the next one a little bit better. But it's great because it's so visually easy to grasp, and so it's not like you're trying to learn a complex shape and how to fill an area. So if you're newer to machine quilting, you might find this one a little bit easier. But I definitely would not suggest using a ruler, especially for this one. All those lines are pretty short, and if you're going to use a ruler for all of them, it's going to take a lot longer to quilt that design, and you're really not going to get that much return on your quilting investment or your quilting time. Now, of course, I'm not telling you what to do. You might have a propensity to perfectionism that you want to have those nice straight ones. Perfect. Go for it. Do whatever you will do. But when it comes to these lines, I'm aiming for straight-ish, and sometimes they're more ish than straight. And so here you can kind of see that effect there. I'm not worried that all the boxes are the same size, and I really don't want them to be the same size because it's going to look pretty repetitive. I just want a nice all-over texture. But I am trying to make sure there's no big unquilted areas that pop out. So that would be the one thing that I would try to focus on. And just like all the other fillers we learned last week with the swirls, we can echo around those previously quilted shapes to maneuver our way around the area. So you can definitely do that as well. Now this one, we're kind of taking that boxy shape, but we're just making it a little bit bigger and echoing inside of it. This is the one that I prefer because I like to take bigger chunks and then use echoing to fill them in. This works great in borders. It works great in backgrounds. It really works great anywhere that you want that kind of geometric shape. And if you're quilting this on your quilts, you may feel tempted to use a ruler, and that's totally fine. In fact, I think in the handout, I don't think it's in the video, but you can use a ruler to maybe create the outside of your shape, the biggest part of your box, and then freehand the echoing if you want. That's going to give you the best of both worlds. The great thing about this shape is as you continue, you quilt your square and you echo on the inside, those lines are going to get shorter and shorter. So make your initial square as big as you want that to be because they're going to get easier as you work your way down. Everything else that we learned, though, still kind of applies. If you want those nice sharp corners, you can hesitate. And this is just going to fill those bigger areas a little bit quicker. So either way, still the same boxy shape, still that geometric look, but just a little bit more echoing to it. Now, these are like my children, and I know I'm not supposed to have favorites, but this one is one of my favorites. The merged line design is so fun in how it looks, and really how it goes together is really, really easy. but I have taught it enough in person to know that some quilters struggle with getting confused on where to go next. What happens is once you fill in that whole area, all you see is the whole design. You can't really see the sections. So in the diagrams, I tried to break up the sections and kind of recolor them so you could really see where those are. To distill it down to its easiest point, I'm just quilting my line like we saw in the video, and I'm echoing above it. So I'm making a space and filling it in, making a space and filling it in at any point, knowing that if I get off track, I can just add some more echo lines. This is going to be best for those medium-sized areas. Don't you like how vague that is? Like, what's medium? Well, when I'm quilting those straight lines, if I'm working in an area that's too big, I'm going to have really long straight lines, and maybe I might kind of struggle with that. So I'm thinking like, 6 to 12 inches, but I do have an example I'll show you here in a second where I kind of stretched it out. Try to keep the spacing consistent with this. It's the most important thing with this design. And the more you vary those angles, the more you switch it up, the more you're going to get that cool little woven look. And what I love, love, love about using it on this panel is it shows you that those sides of your area don't have to be straight. Now, this design does need a defined boundary. It needs two defined sides because it goes from one point to the other. So one side could be a block, the other side could be the edge of the area. It could be quilting, it could be a block. I just need to know what are those defined edges. In this instance, they just happen to be angled. And that's totally fine. I'm still going to go from one side to the other, travel, and echo. Now, if you watch the video, you know there's a lot of traveling on the edge of this design, but the result is worth it. That's what gives it that look that it's kind of weaving in and among each other. We're going to see this again the last week because I have another variation to show, but it was so good I had to save it and break them apart a little bit. So this design, though, just adds an interesting geometric texture, but it's not going to distract from anything, but it's a little bit more than just your basic straight lines. So it's kind of like just a little bit of extra texture. This is an example I showed during one of my live chats when I talked about nature-inspired designs. But you can see here, again, the same idea, just a little bit more of it quilted in a more square area. But again, having my line, echoing above it. And like I said in the video, if you find yourself in the center and you need to be on the edge, just travel and get over there. Or you could start a new line of quilting if you want to. So the main idea is I want to fill in those areas and get to the edge if possible. Now I showed this on the long arm on the panel, and this is a pretty small area that I filled in. The panel, the center block is probably like, I don't know, yay big. It does work in smaller areas. You just don't have as much room to get your curve in there, but you can definitely create some cool effects. So if you're feeling comfortable with the design, you can fit it into some smaller areas too. Just in the beginning, giving yourself a little bit more room will give you kind of some time to figure out where you're going with it. Now, I loved this. I used this on a panel or a quilt I did for my husband with the National Parks panel. And this is a perfect example of a medium spaced area. It's even irregular, right? I'm using that design within the clouds and in between that center, but you can see I still have my line, and it's just an interesting shape. And so it's definitely worth learning. And I promise if you're struggling with it, once it clicks, you'll see, oh, it's really easy. It just takes a second to figure out where you're going next. Now, the reason I don't suggest quilting it in bigger areas, at least in my classes, this is kind of a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing, is if I add multiple turns, right? So we only have one in our video. In this example, I did multiple. Well, it's a lot easier to get stuck. You have to kind of maneuver your way in and out. Definitely fun to do. I just don't ever teach it because it's just too discouraging if you're learning the basic. But once you learn that shape, if you want to, you can try adding a couple extra curves and then filling it in. And you can see here the result is a cool texture that looks amazing. So once you get comfortable with it, you can definitely use it in bigger areas should you feel froggy and want to leap on it. And then my computer just froze up. Hold on a second. Well, you gotta like when the videos things. Let's just come back here. So my pictures just kind of froze up on me. We'll see if I can't get that back up there. But after the merge lines, then we kind of stopped. So that was like four designs that we learned in the video. Well, then moving on from there, I just released the connecting triangles one. And so this one, if you haven't checked it out yet, I just put it out like at 1 o'clock today. It's one of those designs where I'm just kind of creating straight lines. But the trickiest part about it, I think, is that it can be, you don't know exactly what's going to look like when you start. For me, I have no problem with that, right? I can just, wing it. But I know that for some of us that want to know exactly what it's going to look like when it's done, you're going to have to put some trust in and just know that it's going to be fine. So basically what I was doing with that is I was quilting some different triangles, but I was also incorporating a little bit of texture in it. Now, what does that even mean? I'm putting some back and forth lines in some of them to get me to a different point. So if you go back and look at the thing, which I can't show you video, I don't have the sample next to me. If you go back and look at that, you'll see those little pops of texture. You might be super impressed, like, oh, look at the beautiful look of that. Well, now you know, I'm just using that to maneuver my way around an area. I'm just kind of using it as my little cheat. So you'll have to check that out. Now, I'm also going to release the tiles design where we're using the quilting to break up the space and add fillers. So we're kind of putting our straight lines, but we're going to be incorporating some of the fillers that we've already learned. And so I love using the straight lines next to the curvy. In fact, Georgia in the type chat before I went live said she was a little concerned before we started about putting the geometric next to the flowers. Wasn't sure how that was going to look, but she said she liked it and her eyes were open to it. And I thought that's what's cool about those designs. When they have contrast like that, they really kind of look really nice together. So don't be afraid to use different designs. I almost said dissimilar. Different designs next to each other. That's going to help them pop out from each other. It's going to look really fun. So that video will be coming out soon. And there's also a couple of things in the handouts that I'm not going to show, like the jumbled lines design. You'll have to check that out. It's basically making triangles and adding echoing, but also the broken echoes design, which is just echoing, but instead of connecting them, I'm just splitting them apart. So you'll have to check out the free diagrams for that. And since my computer is locked up in the pictures, I'll have to show pictures with that on maybe the next live chat. On a personal note, my husband surprised me with a brand new computer, which is amazing. I love it, but this is my first time using it. I don't know why the pictures just won't come up. Anyway, so if you're trying to quilt these designs, something I said in the video, but I didn't harp on, was that I don't necessarily use a ruler. Some of those lines, again, when they're, this long or shorter, I feel like I can freehand those or get the ish, less straight, more ish. But on the long arm, if I'm quilting diagonal lines, straight lines of any length, I'm going to use a straight edge ruler. And in the connected triangles design, I kind of joke, like, if you've tried quilting a diagonal line on a long arm, you know it's not too easy. So, but you don't have to on a sewing machine. What's great about that is you can kind of tweak your quilt. You can move it around and kind of come up with instead of quilting it truly diagonally, you can move more in a horizontal or vertical movement. So I want you to think of the ruler and, like a good straight edge I just happen to have right here. A ruler is a tool, right? So it's going to help you create those straight lines, but I don't want you to think of it as a crutch. Don't want you to think of it as a crutch. If you find that you can do it without it, maybe you do. If you find that you need it, then you use it. It's something that you're going to do to help yourself feel better about the designs. So don't feel like if your lines are more ish than straight. I promise it's going to be fine. When you step back, you're just going to see that overall texture. And I keep harping on it, but I probably will always keep saying this. It's not so much about the individual elements of your design. Once that whole thing is filled in and you stand back, you're going to see that overall texture. So as you're practicing, especially for those of you, I know in the type chat, you're like getting kind of something like, oh, I'm struggling with this design. You have to remember when you're looking this close that you're going to see all the mistakes. But when you step back, you're going to see that beautiful texture. We just have to get you to that point of continuing on. It's kind of like embracing the suckiness to get to the better part. So I hope that as you work through the geometric shapes of this week's challenge, that you're kind of giving yourself some compassion, using the ruler if you need to, but also knowing that you don't have to, that you're still going to get that beautiful, beautiful texture. Well, I know I'm kind of done since my pictures aren't working. Is there any questions that came up, Jessica? Might as well address those. Now the next video, we're going to be talking, next week's challenge, we're going to be talking about pointy fillers, but really it's just all the fillers I couldn't fit into the geometric or the swirls. So we're going to be kind of doing a nice sampler platter of different designs and different fillers, and I'll be sharing where you'll use those. So hopefully you're building your quilt, whether it's the custom panel or your own thing, so you have a little sample quilt to look at. Can I give you an idea of how big to do the designs? I'm afraid I'm making them too small. Well, anybody that has taken a class from me knows the answer. It depends. When I try to give design or like size suggestions, I'm always hesitant because I don't want it to seem like it's a rule. So it just depends on what you want. I know that doesn't really help you. If you find you're quilting them too small, that's fine. Everybody has a natural size that you kind of trend towards. And as you're learning the design, don't try to force yourself to learn the design and to quilt it in a size that's uncomfortable for you. Just quilt it wherever you're at. Quilt it whatever size you're doing. Then once you learn the shape, then you can work on making it bigger and smaller. I know I use this analogy a lot, but it's so true. It's like handwriting. When you first started writing your letters, your teacher wasn't telling you to make sure you keep them small. All your teacher wanted you to do is make sure you knew the letters, and then you can write them or make them bigger or smaller. So as you're practicing, don't worry about that. Just learn the design. But as you're working on the quilts, the hardest thing is going to be if you have a tendency to quilt small, but you don't want to spend forever on the quilt, then you're gonna have to kind of get used to changing up that size and that spacing between the lines, and that will come with practice. Instead of focusing on the individual design, focus on the space between the lines. I cannot say that enough. And I know like it's one of those things that will roll over your head until it sinks in one time and you're like, oh, that makes sense. So like the boxy meander, that initial box size doesn't matter because it's the echoing, the spacing between that determines it. So do whatever size feels comfortable, and then just know it'll work itself out. Usually though, in my examples, they're usually about 1/4 of an inch apart because I like to use my foot as a guide. I hope that helps. I know that's kind of vague, but hopefully that gives you a help. Wavy lines and wavy swirls are difficult. Do I have any tips to make them easier? Well, it's hard to know, to give any advice when I don't know exactly what you find difficult about them. Here's a couple tips, and we're gonna see this again, but tips for quilting wavy line designs. On a sewing machine, I prefer to work vertically. If I'm working horizontally, I'm gonna constantly keep running into my machine and not be able to get that good momentum down. So I'd rather work vertically. Sometimes you might find that you're quilting too slow. I don't know, but I mean, in general, that's a stereotype. But as we slow down, it's hard to get that momentum and you might get more kind of jaggedy lines. So going a little bit faster will help you get that smoother kind of movement down. Looking ahead of where you're at is huge too. When you're looking right at the needle, it's hard to, you need to look ahead of where you're going and trust your hands to bring you there. So that's just 3 that I'll give you just right off the bat. But in the last week of this challenge, we will be talking about wavy line designs and in a bunch of different ways. So hopefully that will help. If you can't wait until then, one thing you can do is get a quilt sample, draw a couple of wavy lines, different, like maybe one's a bit more gentle, one's a little bit more wavy, and kind of quilt along them to kind of get the idea of the movement, just kind of tracing over that and then seeing which one feels comfortable and building off of it. I promise it will get better. Do I use the same thread weight in the top and bobbin of my machine? It depends. You know that was going to be the answer. The cool thing about quilting is that you can use any type of thread in the top and bottom. You can use different types, different colors, different weights. You can mix and match. You don't have to use the same. That being said, in general, keeping it the same will help. Not the same, but within a range. I don't use the same weight. So the glide that I love to use, that is the coordinating thread kit, all that, that's a 40 weight thread. And so I love how it's a little bit thicker, that little bit of sheen really looks great on the quilts. But in my bobbin, on my long arm, I use a 60 weight thread, just because that's what the pre-wounds come in. On my sewing machine, I think it's a 50 weight pre-wound. So it's not the same weight, but it doesn't have to be. So the most important thing is that you use quality thread and that your bobbin is wound tightly and correctly. If your bobbin is squishy, that's not going to give you a good result. So as long as your bobbins are winding fine and your tension is set, you can switch it up. So I know that's a very, very long answer to that. On a different note, I'm thinking about hosting a little like Zoom class on thread, needles, and tension. So you should leave a comment, let me know if you're interested. I know I have a lot to talk about on that, and it's something that would better fit a class format than a live chat. I never know how to quilt improv quilts. Any tips? Oh man, when the modern quilting movement first started, that improv quilting started coming in, those can be difficult because you have a lot of different size pieces. You're like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of different things going on. This probably would warrant its own live chat, how to quilt improv quilts. A couple of things, and again, every improv quilt is different, right? Because it's improvisationally pieced. Those of you that are not sure what I'm talking about, it's quilts that are pieced randomly and so there's nothing regular about them. The blocks aren't regular. The blocks aren't always the same. There's either big spaces or little spaces or both. So couple things you can do off the top of your head. Let's say I have an improv quilt and there's a bunch of different colors, but my favorite color is red. So maybe in all the red pieces, I'll quilt pebbles, but in the rest of the quilt, I'll do swirls or a geometric all over. Another thing I'll do is if I have a lot of small pieces, I'll join them together to make bigger sections to fill in. So just kind of using those little things to make it a little bit easier to quilt. If it's very, depends on the quilt, of course. And I can see a bunch in my head, but I know you can't see my head, so there's that. If it's very picturesque, that's not the word, it's very detailed, very like graphic, a lot of stuff going on, those can be the hardest to quilt because you don't want to have the quilting overwhelm that. So a lot of straight line quilting in those instances. A lot of straight line quilting, a lot of echoing, a lot of quilting maybe ghost blocks in bigger areas. But really look at it as an opportunity to kind of stretch your quilting skills. When I had started quilting, when the modern quilting movement kind of started, I had been long arming for about 7 years, and I loved quilting traditional quilts, but it's like I need a feather for a block, I need a feather for a border, and something for the background. So it was very easy to pick designs, but then I started getting these quilts that are all different, like shapes and different stuff, and it really did kind of like stretch you a little bit, but it's good. It helps you kind of work through some of those things. So don't look at it as a challenge, or don't look at it as a problem, look at it as a challenge. It's going to help you get better at dealing with those things. So hopefully that helps. I will make a note of that and use that on a future live chat. I think that's a lot we could talk about on that. All right, so as you're working through this week's free motion challenge, I hope that you will have fun with it. If you have any questions, you can always leave that on the Facebook group, or you can leave them in the comments on the video. From time to time, I get on there and answer them, and I hope that you have fun with them, because next week we're going to kind of leave the straight lines and come back to the curvy, pointy, kind of combine the two and see some different designs that aren't your normal, typical, necessarily designs that you necessarily see. Well, anyway, so I thank you so much for joining me. I know that we're all busy, and the fact that you would take time to spend with me for the live chat, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. And I will see you next Tuesday with the next video in the Free Motion Challenge. And of course, next Thursday, 3 p.m. Central is when I have my live chat. So until then, everybody, happy quilting.